Welcome to The Jungle, where we discuss social science and applications to business and society. My name is Doug Lepisto, and I am co-founder of Sleeping Giant Capital and the Center for Principal Leadership and Business Strategy at Western Michigan University. Today, my guest is Dr. Lauren Rivera, Professor of Management and Organizations at Northwestern University's Kellogg School of Management. She's a world expert on how evaluations of merit in hiring and employment create social inequality. We discuss her research and recent book, Pedigree, How Elite Students Get Elite Jobs. I hope you enjoy the conversation. How are you?
I'm good. How are you?
I'm a longtime admirer of your work.
Oh, thank you.
So you started because you were a Michelle Lamont student, right?
Mhm. Yeah.
So I don't know how I got familiar with her work. I almost want to say I was an undergrad maybe here at Kalamazoo College. And I don't know how I came upon her. And this was like before Ph.D. and everything else. And I'm like, wow, this is really interesting.
That's awesome.
What was it like? What was it like working with her?
She's a great mentor. She's a really great mentor. Yeah. She's very, very smart, both about all intellectual matters, but also in terms of how do you write a paper? How do you frame an argument? So I learned a lot from her, which was amazing.
And what was that like working with her in terms of like her approach and how that shaped your thinking? Because my PhD advisor was Mike Pratt, big qualitative research, person, kind of a trailblazer in that way, and really shaped and interested on identity, meaning of work, meaningful work, culture, and then just lots of wide ranging interests. So I'm just, how did she shape your thinking?
Yeah, I mean, when I went to grad school, I didn't think I was going to be a qualitative researcher. I thought I was going to be a social network analyst. And Peter Marsden, who was going to be my advisor, was on leave my first year. And Michelle had started, I guess, my second year. So I entered my second year. I had loved qualitative methods in my first year, and took her class. And I was like, wait a minute, this seems like the avenue for me. And so methodologically, it definitely shaped things. And then, like you said, with big qualitative studies, I mean, Michelle is a fan of very large sample sizes. And so I think for my book, for example, which was based off my dissertation, I probably would have stopped a little sooner, but she was very much into 40 per case and things like this. But she was a great intellectual partner, and she taught me, the basics of qualitative research and also how to navigate just the profession, because I did not grow up in an academic family, and a lot of the norms we have are slightly weird and kind of exclusionary. And so that was helpful to have an insider coach me through those things.
An insider coach you. How much does that story factor into your research interest and kind of motivation? Because on the one hand, I read your book and I thought, well, she's from these elite places, right? She went to Yale, she went to Harvard, and she was at Monitor Group, where you were in the London office and I was in the Chicago office. When were you there?
I was there 2000 to 2002. When were you there?
Okay. 2007 to 2009.
Were you with John Bratland at all?
Name sounds familiar a little bit.
He was there briefly. I guess I can't remember if he was there also before London and then after. He went to business school, but he was one of our KC leaders. But yeah, Chicago, awesome.
Yeah. No, and so the monitors. I mean, that's another fascinating place and story, and just really interesting. But all these elite places, and so I thought, what's the interest that you have, being in that world, but also showing and doing research on what stops people from getting into it. And I'm just curious how that interest came about.
Yeah. I was always interested in the dynamics of social status. I grew up in a family that in some respects is hard to classify. My mom was a single parent. My dad was incarcerated. She had to work a variety of low wage jobs to make ends meet. I did, however, have a grandparent who was quite wealthy, who made his money illegally through smuggling things. And so, we really did struggle to pay our bills every day, to have food on the table, things like this. But then my grandfather would fly in and take me to Paris or pay for ballet classes, even though we had no food, because it would help me marry a rich man one day. And so I kind of had this weird cross, even growing up, of working class in my background versus kind of touches with affluence. And then we lived in a small town in the Pacific Northwest, and my mom she worked for the airlines at that point. It was actually worked for a tiny little airline where she was flagging in the planes, right? And then she'd run over and take everyone's ticket and the whole business. And there was supposedly a job at United. And so we moved back to Los Angeles where she had spent her high school years. And my grandfather lived there. And we moved there, and United, I guess, filed for Chapter 11, and there was no job or things like that. So she kind of had to scramble. And we ended up there. And I was about to say my son or my husband, I need more coffee, clearly. Neither of those two. My brother got a scholarship to go to a prep school for basketball because my brother was a really talented athlete. I should say is a talented athlete, although he's older, so he does other things with his life. But and so he went there for free on scholarship, which was awesome. And I was not athletic, but my mom was always a big proponent of education. She grew up partially in the United States, partially outside of the United States. And she always thought that education was the ticket to opportunity here. And so she took me to that interview, even though I didn't have like a kind of marketable scholarship skill. And in the middle of the interview, the person who ran the bookstore, who sold books to students and athletic equipment and things like that, quit. And she's like, I can do that job. Why don't you hire me? And they did on the spot, which meant that I got in, but I could also go for free because I was a faculty child, or a staff child, I should say. But that was my exposure to elite worlds in terms of seeing tremendous wealth. I mean, those are places. I remember one story that calls to mind. The amount of wealth was there was a kid in my class. We were all lining up on the football field to do like a graduation ceremony, and when we were graduating 12th grade, and we blocked the entrance for cars. And a car came through with a little Mercedes convertible. And one of the kids who was the class clown just kind of looks at the car, goes, "Who do you think you are?" And it was Steven Spielberg driving in to like pick up his kid. But seeing this tremendous wealth was just very confusing for me. And by the end of, and came from a very different economic place, but by the end of high school, I'd kind of learned how to fake it to fit in socially. Kind of how do you fake being an LA elite person in terms of how you speak and how you dress and kind of smiling at everyone and things like this. And then I had gotten into Yale because I had that drive in the bottom of me that, I wanted to be able to pay for food for myself and my family. And again, if education in our family was perceived as the ticket to be able to not rely on other people or to be able to feed yourself, I was going to overachieve on that dimension. And so I went to Yale, and it was a whole other dimension of wealth that was it was not only wealth, but it was cultural capital, right? This idea of people spoke about art and film and literature and read the New Yorker, and I just smiled and kind of looked like an LA person. And that also it was very, again, kind of confusing, but reading Bourdieu really brought it together for me in terms of my junior year. I read, and the different aspects of social class being both economic and cultural were just really fascinating. It was eye-opening for me in a lot of respects. And then you talked about exclusion. Like, I was always interested in how people size other people up, and how do people know who to gravitate towards, and why are all the people from the similar class background or similar geography clustering together, or similar race, right? Why does this happen? But I actually wanted to study it in a very different context, which was academic hiring, because I had been in grad school. I had been the graduate student representative on our junior faculty search. And I saw a lot of what we were doing was screening actually on social class signals, especially through this idea of like research versus me search. But I couldn't get access to academic search committees. And I used to work in Monitor, right? I went to Yale, so everyone I know was a banker, consultant, or a lawyer, so I could get access to that world. So it's a very long way of answering the question. It stems from a biographical interest, but also kind of just observing the world around me, but also concerned about research access.
It's so interesting because I love that. That is an amazing story. Just in terms of the story itself, but then and what you had to overcome and do, and what that, but then the experience of it, but then also like it gives you that it's so funny being an academic where you can sometimes take you can just see the theory happening in your life, in your experience, right? And as a qualitative person, that makes a huge difference. And it's also fun, and so I'm a professor, but I also have raised this investment fund. We're buying businesses and everything else. It's fun to take that theory and experience and then apply it and actually do something with it and try to change things with it. I mean, what I thought is so interesting about what you said is the confusing, the faking, the notion that these worlds are just really different. And I just, I think many people would resonate with that. And is that a commentary then on like what's true in our experience about how segregated the United States is in some ways? Or I don't know what the word, segregated, stratified, separated into these worlds that you enter them and they are things unto themselves. They're so separate.
Yeah, I think that, we do live in a society that's extremely segregated socially, culturally, economically, racially. And we as humans generalize from our experience and we think that what we're experiencing is what everyone experiences, right? We are great at a lot of things as a species. Perspective taking is not one of them. And so I think that until you see that the world could be a different way, it's you don't necessarily have reason to question it. An example of this to illustrate just how not how segregated things are necessarily, but the idea is that we take for granted whatever is in our world as normal and natural. My mom, as I mentioned, had a really, really bizarre life. She was stateless. Her family had fled Vienna after Kristallnacht, things like this. She grew up all over the world, and she was a child of a smuggler. And she grew up thinking all sorts of things were normal, like hiding like random things that were being smuggled in her bag for school, or having a suitcase that was a false bottom suitcase that you could line with various types of contraband. And when I would talk to her, I would ask her to tell me these stories as I got older about these interesting experiences she'd have. And she would say, "Oh, well, I was once at a restaurant and I saw a famous person." And I said, "Mom, no, 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 no. Like, tell me the interesting stuff." Like, and she's like, "But," and I would bring up like the false bottom suitcase. She's like, "But that's normal. Everyone has that." I'm
Hmm.
like, "No, Mom, not everyone is the child of a smuggler who is involved in weird trafficking rings." But I mean, you see it in kids, right? Kids grow up thinking whatever they're exposed to is normal in the way it is, and it's very adaptive in some respects because we got to get through our days. But that makes it such that when we're encountering difference, it can be really eye-opening. And too often, we are not encountering differences. We're just interacting with people who are sociodemographically and culturally like ourselves.
So the experience then, so then you in terms of your bio, you got your PhD
Mhm.
after grad school. You work professionally at Mono Group management in management consulting,
Mhm.
and that firm hires from the elite schools and the elite places. I mean, I tell everybody the only reason I went to Kalamazoo College as an undergrad, which nobody knows, but is really a nice reputation, liberal arts school here, but nobody knows Kalamazoo College. But if I said, well, I got my master's at the University of Chicago, oh, okay. And then, how do I actually apply to get a job in management consulting or even get considered at Monitor? Well, it's because I went to the University of Chicago. It's not because, I just had access, right? And I could capitalize on the opportunity when I got there. I teach at Western Michigan University, and it suffer. I think about your research frequently, you know, because it's my students are at a solid R1 regional public school. And, I've been to University of Chicago and Monitor and Boston College and this and that. And I come kind of back to Kalamazoo, and one, you realize that, yeah, they don't even imagine that world. It's difficult to even see it. But once they're there, they need to access it, and they can't access it. And once they access it, then they're like, man, this is crazy. This is like a totally different world.
Yeah.
right? And so your research, I think, just comes to life for me in terms of what my students experience.
No, thank you. And I think I'm glad that it resonates, but it's also unfortunate that it resonates because, you know, our society is so stratified by social class, and it's something that we don't talk about. And one of the ways that that happens is through access to high status and prestigious colleges and universities. And I do think, and I show in my book, that it is taken for granted in high status professional circles that are predominantly occupied by white upper and upper middle class men and women that, you know, going to a place like University of Chicago or Yale is accessible and possible if you're just smart enough. And unfortunately, that's not the case, right? We know from all of our research in sociology that there are so many things that have to be set up in your life. And, most of those don't actually have to do with individual ability. They have to do with the resources and the environment in which you grew up that matter in terms of college destinations. And there are a lot of really talented students at Western Michigan University and Kalamazoo College. And but they're not being recognized as such because people have overly narrow views of where talent resides.
So you have your PhD from Harvard in sociology, and so I'm kind of sitting at this podcast is kind of now becoming the center of business and social science and I don't know what it is, but we're in that kind of world. But you got trained as a PhD academic
Yep.
at Harvard in sociology, and did your dissertation that became a book called Pedigree, and you have a series of kind of studies off that. How about you first maybe characterize, like, how would you describe your research interests? I mean, I have on your website how people define and evaluate merit in employment and education can reproduce or challenge existing social inequalities by social class, gender, race, and disability status. So could
Yeah.
you say more about that area of interest or in expertise?
So I'm basically interested in how people who control valued stuff, I call them gatekeepers, make decisions about how to distribute stuff we care about, right? And the role that social identities and social positions play in that. And so it really is this idea of gatekeeping and equality. You know, so much of social inequality, and when I talk about social inequality, in as you know, in sociology, people sometimes use the words inequality and stratification in a way that's very similar. I think of stratification as the process through which social inequalities are produced and maintained. And oftentimes, social stratification is that process is there are critical moments that happens, critical gatekeeping moments, whether it's applying to college or applying to a job, or in some of my later work, the paper that just came out on disability status, gaining access to a preferred school, things like this. There are these series of little decisions that in and of themselves might seem minor that really do create forks in the road for people and the opportunities that they're allowed to access based off of social identity characteristics that are social or structural in nature, as opposed to what we typically think of when we talk about merit, which is individual ability, motivations, drive. I would go one step further to say that I think that, and other sociologists would agree, that this whole idea of distributing things on merit is a little Pollyanna-ish, in that merit is inherently subjective and it is a moving target. We know that definitions of it have changed through history, and the way that we define and evaluate it tends to privilege those who are already in power, right? So, but again, with research interest, I would say, in terms of social stratification, the process through which high status groups preserve advantages and low status groups continue to be excluded from them.
So stratification is a process that produces different groups, and those different groups around things we care about, valued resources. And that stratification process, the actions of it are critical. I love this, critical moments.
Yeah.
You sound like a symbolic interactionist, right? It's like, it's not men and their moments, it's moments and their men, Irving Goffman, Randall Collins, right? And so critical moments. And so how do you study that?
Yeah. So what's nice about it is if you're studying these critical moments, these junctures, these forks in the road where there is a gatekeeper who says, I want you and not you in my organization, in my world, you go and you study those moments. It gives you something that's really defined that you can observe or you can talk to people about. So in Pedigree, I look at the hiring transaction out of undergrad or grad school, where employers are going directly to colleges and universities or not going to other colleges and universities to select new hires. Or in the educational domain, I have two projects, one that just came out on public schools and another on private schools, but looking at that point of either, in the case of public schools, access to information in terms of who gets information about various public schools and their services, or in the case of a paper I have right now that's in progress with Estella Diaz, who's a PhD student at Columbia, we're looking at private school admissions and we're interviewing admissions officers. And her dissertation is actually an ethnography of a preschool consultancy in Manhattan and looking at how kids are coached to perform well to enter private, selective pre-K through 12 independent schools that serve as feeders to the Ivy League. So, you kind of look at these moments and then talk to the people involved in making decisions. But in an ideal world, you'd also follow it up with something behavioral in terms of observing what they do, because we know that what people say they do isn't always what they do, especially when you're talking about sensitive prospects and projects like who are we going to admit to our school or admit to our company.
So you're observing what they say, and you're observing what they do, and then you're actually quantifying what the doing results in outcomes, right? And that,
I mean, it depends on the method, right? So for audit experiments, for field experiments, yes, that elements of quantification is involved. There's always a debate within qualitative methods about quantifying, right? Is the point that we're trying to quantify how much this matters, or are we revealing ways through which things happen? And I would say when I'm doing exclusively qualitative projects, I'm really not trying to understand process as opposed to, the magnitude of effect. Like if you're going to do a study where you're trying to understand how much class discrimination there is in elite professional service firms qualitatively, it's going to be harder to do that. That's why I'm Josh Tilchik and I did a field study, right? We did an audit experiment in these firms where you can really quantify the magnitude.
So we won't go, which is quite the rabbit hole, right? So the rest of the podcast on qualitative, quantifying qualitative data. Is that good or bad? Is that allowed? Is that not allowed? It's a mess.
And I think there is a place for quantification in qualitative.
Yeah, 100%. Well, I think you're doing
a little hard.
Yeah, I think you're observing what people do, but I think you're also relating what they do to outcomes.
Yeah.
And that's like, and that outcome is, do I hire, do I not hire, and explaining variation in that outcome, right? Because that's the gatekeeper. It's do you hire, do you not hire, and then what happens to explain that? Like that's your kind of and then it's a process explanation, it's a variance explanation. And what I love about what you've done though is you have qualitative, watching people in the actual meeting doing it, right? Not just self-reports of this, right? Yeah. You get to see it. And then you can also quantify some of these things, like in other ways that you've done in some of your other research, which is the resume studies, I think are really powerful in that way, right? They're natural. It's a natural, very nice experiment you can run. And it's so real, and you can just see the effect from that. And so I just think that's important, that you're clearly pointing at behaviors that drive discrimination, inequality in a moment. It's not a structural argument that the structural argument gets up there, but you're bringing it down to the actual, here's what it is. If your resume says this, if you put this word versus that word in some of those things, you get different outcomes.
Yeah. And I think those interactions are where my true interest lies, right? In terms of the way, again, boiling down to the way that people evaluate other people in various social arenas, and what is the net, pattern that results from that.
And so can you maybe give a high level argument from the book in terms of you adopt a, kind of, would it be fair to say a kind of Bourdieu perspective? Right. So this is a French sociologist very interested in culture and this kind of the tastes and habits. Could you kind of explain the framework you have on that book of how you're thinking about how the stratification process occurs?
Yeah, yeah. So the overall thing that happens in elite professional services hiring is that what we see is a trend in which has been substantiated by prior research, which is that students from the most elite backgrounds, whether you define that by the education of a student's parents or their level of income, tend to get these jobs, right? They have a market advantage. And these jobs are high status in terms of they're well regarded. They provide open doors to future employment prospects, but also they're paying usually double or more what is offered by other firms competing in the space for the same students. I mean, right now, when I wrote the book, coming into a large law firm after law school with no real prior work experience, you'd be paid $160,000. Word on the street is in New York that those starting salaries for someone, again, who might be 25 years old with no work experience is closer to $250,000 per year as a starting. And those are really high figures that can catapult someone in kind of to the top income brackets that we know are disproportionately driving income inequality. And I start with that puzzle of how does this happen? We live in an era in which, in theory, spots in elite colleges, in theory, spots in firms, how we evaluate people is based off of individual merit. If social class isn't really a thing, like we would like to pretend it is in the United States, how do we end up with this situation? And in the book, I use Bourdieu to unpack the various ways in which employers actually produce this. And so throughout the entire recruiting process, their choices of where and where not to recruit, their methods for evaluating resumes, what they focus on in job interviews, the fact that they even do job interviews, ends up perpetuating class inequality and the reproduction of privilege, even if it's not necessarily intentional. And so I draw from Bourdieu to talk about the various ways that these screens are classed. And Bourdieu talks about, as you mentioned, economic inequality as being reproduced not only by advantages people hold in terms of material resources, but also cultural resources. These are lifestyles, tastes, styles, signals, ways of perceiving and viewing the world that are valued by gatekeepers in elite settings. And one of the strongest one, to go back to the beginning of our conversation, is actually the status of your educational credential, right? That is, Bourdieu would call it a form of institutionalized cultural capital, right? In terms of it's a credential, and what's valued is the status of that credential. It marks the bearer as being more worthy. And the various other screens, like in the resume process, evaluating extracurricular activities, which we know are more likely to be pursued by students from affluent and highly educated households, and in particular, valuing traditionally upper class sports in those resume screens. That also perpetuates this class privilege, because one of the biggest predictors of whether or not someone attends and enrolls, I should say, is admitted to and enrolls in a very elite college is, again, parental social class. So when you are only allowing people to really be considered who go to these very prestigious universities, you're doing this very strong sort on social origin, social class, that then you're screening again on, of all the people who are admitted to Harvard and Princeton, who played varsity sports and who of the varsity athletes actually played lacrosse, things like this. That again narrows the pool in terms of social class, that by the time you get to interviews, where interviewers are really strongly evaluating applicants on the basis of these class-based cultural styles and interactional patterns of speaking, holding your body, presenting, etc., you narrow it down to an even more class homogenous population.
So it's almost like
Sorry, I realize my Outlook is open, so I'm trying to not interfere with your audio by closing all these guys, so nothing else.
No, you're fine. No, you're fine. So it's these small cues that you learn about how to talk and how to walk and how to play the role, how to play the part in the way that an audience says, yeah, you're doing it right. And we kind of all know those things, right? It's like, this is how you act on a golf course. This is how you act in a classroom. This is how you interact, and sometimes we don't. But if you can play that part, you're liked more. You get access to resources, but it's not about the amount of money you have so you can prep for that interview. It's just kind of the way it's in some ways the ways that you walk in and what you do.
Well, it is the ways that you walk in and what you do, but that knowledge is not distributed equally across,
Mm-hmm.
experiences. You said, we behave one way on the golf course. Most people who are outside upper middle class, upper class circles probably aren't spending much time on a golf course, right? There are rules and
Mm-hmm.
that in theory anyone can master, but in reality knowledge and practices tends to be limited to people of a certain social class background. But also Bourdieu would argue that even if you try to learn how to carry yourself on a golf course later in life, you may learn how to do that, but it's not going to seem as natural as someone who's been doing this for 20 years. And we see that in elite professional service firms too, in terms of there are companies now that have emerged that will do one-on-one coaching, that you can pay however many thousands of dollars to be trained to get an interview or perform well on your interview at Goldman or McKinsey or any of these places. But there's a question of, is that training enough? And part of what was interesting in how my respondents talked about this is there's this fine line between knowing the rules of the game and seeming over rehearsed or coached. They wanted to make
Mm-hmm.
sure natural. So if you seem like you're memorizing a PowerPoint slide that someone gave you, that wasn't natural. They wanted to see if you could improvise. And there could be very good reasons for that. But the net effect of those reasons is that they're privileging people who've had long-term exposure to these ways of seeing and being that ends up screening people out on the basis of social origin and other sociodemographic characteristics.
Candy Jones, she was at Boston College. She's now at University of Sheffield, I believe. And when she was describing some of your work to me for the first time, she's like, "Yeah, it's so fascinating. It's like, and what it makes sense." But she like shows it. It's like, well, you put wrestling on your resume, and I mean something totally different than to these audiences than lacrosse or crew.
Yeah. Yeah. And
And
it, oh, go ahead.
no, please.
I was going to say it's interesting because there's a spot for difference and novelty that's exciting to people, right? So I remember in the book I talk about one guy who saw a resume that said high stakes dice rolling on it, and he was so intrigued by this that when you're evaluating so many resumes and so many people, and things have changed a little bit with the pandemic, and I'm happy to talk about that, but it gets boring, and you're looking for something to amuse yourself that could be interesting. But in general, things that are stereotypically lower class or working class do not yield excitement in these evaluators. They don't say, oh, cool, wrestling, that's different, right? Or, oh, cool, NASCAR, right? They have stereotypes that come into their mind that conflict with their stereotypes of what the ideal employee for these firms are. But high stakes
What
dice rolling, totally kind of macho, risk taking, things like this, that could be exciting.
And so you can imagine in your mind that there's this dance going on between kind of displays of behavior on both sides, and people are trying to figure out if what this is, what the chemistry is. And then I think about your American Journal of Sociology paper on excitement, and you just said it, excitement and emotion as this thrill that when it works, the synchrony works and the signals go back and forth in this way. It's like they're tantalized, and that's a fit, and can you share more about that? I think it's so fast. It's so true. In fact, I mean, I can see it happening, and it's just fascinating.
Yeah, evaluators would just, and by evaluator, I mean people who are screening resumes or interviewers, would describe the selection of a candidate in terms of reading that interaction as like being on a date, right? When something just clicks, when you have things in common, when there's something that makes you excited about something, it carries the way. And that paper is based off of the work of Randall Collins, which is so one of his theories of interactional ritual chains suggests that people are kind of like these excitement seekers or these emotional energy seekers. They go and they're like kind of like moths to the light. They seek out this excitement in everyday action. And these moments can provide interviewers with that. And especially before the pandemic, when people were physically on campus, interviewing 12 people in a row per day, it is boring, right? And so
Mm.
needed at the feelings of excitement. And so finding that spark can be really exciting. But in addition, people use that feeling of excitement as a proxy for merit. There was this really strong belief in these firms, and I think it's not just in these firms, I think it's a part of US culture more broadly, that the way I feel about something is a measure of how good it is. And so people assume that job candidates that made them feel good, whether it was about themselves or just in the moment it was fun, were somehow better applicants.
Mhm.
And it's this idea of a positive affect we know from research in behavioral economics and psychology can result in a halo effect that, I'm just going to evaluate things more positively when, or there's qualities and traits when I feel positively about them. But they actually use that we call it affect as information, right? They actually use the presence or absence of feelings of excitement as a metric of merit, in that a good job candidate should make me feel excited. I should want to hang out with them. I should want more of them. And I've seen this
Mm.
be the case in academics too. We do
Mhm.
this, even though we should be hiring people on the basis of scholarship or teaching or whatever our organizational priorities are. Too often in these job searches, we come back, who'd you like out there? Whose talk made you feel really excited? It's not whose
Mm.
data was the most robust or who had, the most persuasively organized argument. It's this kind of feeling. And so I'm not saying that we should make decisions without respect to our emotions or anything like this, but we have to be aware of the consequences, that the things that tend to excite evaluators tend to be things that are similar to them, whether it's in research topic, whether it's in social background, and it really can constrain our beliefs and the opportunities that we provide to people in terms of a wider reach of people, ideas, and groups.
So you found, so having this, you're seeing this effect at elite firms, investment banks, management consulting firms, law firms. There's the dance that happens in these critical moments. Signals are giving across, excitement's being had. It's kind of some kind of explanation onto who gets the job and who doesn't.
Yeah.
And the people who can do that are the people who are equipped to be able to do that, who have the training, the experience, the habitus to be able to continue to do that. And so it reproduces itself, right? And elite kids get elite jobs. I'm curious how you think about higher education as an institution, because you talked about employers as an agent in society of reproduction. And I'm curious how you see educational institutions.
Yeah.
Are they do you, I mean, you don't have direct data on this. Maybe you wanted to do a study of university admissions and didn't in that case. But how do you see universities playing that role?
I think they play a huge role. I mean, when it comes to the various institutions that produce social inequality and reproduce it, especially in the United States, I think the number one is actually higher education, right? I would say education in general, because K through 12 is also playing a big role here. But we have one of the most stratified systems of higher education among Western industrialized nations. And that shows up in terms of who actually attends university. And then we have employers who are screening not only on the basis of the possession of a degree, but also the possession of a high status one. You see the employment system kind of further institutionalized already entrenched inequalities by social class, by race, and things like this. So I think they both are really playing a role. And in the book, I call them interlocking systems of inequality, right? And elite universities often lament publicly that, oh, so many of our workers go into investment banking or consulting or increasingly large tech firms, and we don't like this. We're supposed to be producing graduates that change the world. But they contribute to this directly. I mean, if you look at the career offices of Ivy League schools, the easiest thing to recruit for is employment in one of these large prestigious organizations. They benefit from it in terms of national rankings when you look at the
Mhm.
salaries of outgoing students. You know, or in terms of on-campus recruiting, some universities charge pretty hefty fees to employers to recruit their grads. I mean, they benefit monetarily from it. So both of these systems matter. They work together to produce this system. But I've always wanted to look at this work cross-culturally and look at places where higher education is less stratified. So if you go to a country like Switzerland, and I'm not going to say that Switzerland is a diverse society, but higher education there is less stratified by income. My guess is that you'd see more diversity in terms of socioeconomics, in terms of who accesses elite positions, because that screen on having a prestigious credential or having the right credential isn't so stratified by social class.
So how do you think of this? The first line of your book: most Americans believe that hard work, not blue blood, is the key to success.
Yes.
And I read that and I said, I think that's true.
Yeah.
And I also think that would you also agree that people are starting to question that now? They're kind of questioning the notion of well, if you do work hard, if you do have merit, like what does merit mean? And who's benefiting here and who's not benefiting here? And how do you think about that national narrative, I guess, about the rags to riches story and the American dream and the belief in this thing? Or is the system rigged? Is the system rigged and everybody's seeing it's rigged? And if on the right it's rigged and on the left it's rigged, and it's rigged in these different ways, and people are like, yeah, I don't believe that anymore. How do you think about that national narrative?
I would start by saying the system is rigged. Just to put that out there. But I'm not necessarily sure that people have changed their beliefs in terms of that, how rigged it is. I think people are just paying attention to aspects that seem to be, in their perception, not benefiting people who are like them, right? And I think that that's the backlash we're seeing isn't, say, in higher education admissions, isn't that this system is unfair and we should scrap it. Like, if I were me, I'd go to a lottery-based system, right? It's rather, people who aren't like me seem to be getting preference. And in my ideal world, I should be getting preference, and there should be no barriers for me. But if there are barriers for other people, that's their problem, right? So I think the core is that, in my opinion, the United States is so individualistic. I was going to say it's empirically backed that one of the most individualistic countries, again, among Western industrialized nations. But we're so individualistic that the idea behind meritocracy is that it's individual skills and abilities that drive things. I don't think anyone's questioning the individual. In fact, some people, especially on the right, are advocating for an absence of anything that's not individual, right? In terms of guidance, and for the reduction of any kind of attempts at considering the different starting individuals have, right? So
You've done you've done some work on is it Croatia? Is that okay? So I wonder, so what about this, this kind of the national narrative around this, and what explains our ambivalence about this, or our contradiction, our paradox about this? Is it's like, if we don't believe in individual merit and the American dream and the rags to riches, then what does it mean to be an American? Isn't that our story? Isn't that our dream? I mean, from a national identity perspective, I think, it's like, to challenge that is challenging something that I think many Americans think is like the thing about America.
They think that, but I mean, if you look at Horatio Alger, a lot of this stuff like emerged culturally and historically in the early 1900s, right? It was not from the founding of the US. And I'm reading Nicholas Leeman's book, The Big Test, and it's been fascinating to read. It's a journalistic account, but he's generally a pretty thorough empiricist as well. But a lot of this stuff is culturally constructed. It did not actually represent the reality, and it's always overstated things. We've always had kind of a ruling class that is disproportionately controlling resources, whether those are material, bodily, symbolic power, things like this, right? We've always had that. This is just a story we tell ourselves so that people don't fight existing systems of power and stratification. But yes, I do think a lot of people actually believe this, and this is what it means to be from the US. But there are a lot of other things that it means to be from the US. And I'm smiling because, again, my mom was not born here. I was raised by her and my grandmother. My grandmother is not from here. So there are a lot of other defining features of being from the United States other than this meritocracy thing. And again, the meritocracy thing is not necessarily a reality. I mean, if you look at it, like our rates of intergenerational mobility are lower
Yeah.
than
Yeah.
UK and France than so-called static notions, right? And this is not a new thing, but we have this very powerful narrative that keeps people wanting to try.
Okay, so you're saying the story is not real,
Yeah.
right? One, one it's a story, right? Two, you're saying the story is not actually factually baking out, right? Two, three, it was, oh, by the way, not at the founding, so it is maybe quarter identity, but it's not our history. Oh, by the way, okay. So what's the answer then to, like, I think that's many people are looking for this. So who is America? What would you say its narrative is?
So I apologize. I'm getting
Softball question.
let me just have a big cough to buy myself some time to answer it.
I think that's where it goes, though, right? And I think there's so many people that are trying to, and if just from a collective identity, what we, I mean, we know a collective identity. If you have a sense of who we are, right, it's incredibly unifying. And right now, with I don't know what people say. It's you can't drink Bud Light anymore. I saw that people are all protesting Bud Light and this and that. And like, so what's the unifying story of America as a place? What would you say that is? What should it be?
Okay, so I think what is versus what should be is the crux, right? Because I do think, as a pessimistic sociologist, I would say there are several things that unite us. One of them is this belief in rugged individualism, right? And I think we are seeing what happens when you play that out to the extreme, where everyone does think they're out for themselves and it's all about their advantage and their position and kind of me, right? You can't really have a functioning society when people are only concerned about themselves and their children, right? Society to function in a way that it's not like Lord of the Flies requires common norms, common rules. And in my opinion, and this may be an unpopular one, I think having a productive society involves perspective and empathy, right? And those are two things that do not necessarily come naturally to people, that have to be encouraged, and you need social policies and structures in place to build that part of humanity, which is again part of us, but it's not necessarily the most exciting one or the one that comes naturally to us. So I would say that individualism is unfortunately a big part of American culture and history, and it's one of the defining ones compared to other countries that might be similar to us in other respectives. But I don't think that would productively be the basis of a society that would be functioning by all kind of existing metrics of I would say, of humanity. I'm sure there are certain metrics that would say, oh, that's the right one to do, right, in terms of certain people's perspectives. But I would say one that treats other humans as they are, which is humans.
Mm-hmm. Well, it's the 2000 2000 Kalamazoo College Intro to Sociology, first class I took in sociology, Robert Bella, Habits of the Heart. Oh yeah, this idea that like you want to go and quote find yourself away from your parents, like and go off to college. oh, that's just completely made up. That's just a cultural artifact. And I was like, oh, you're just like, it's sociology, like, like hits you and you're like, oh, wow. Like, expressive. Okay. That shapes your work, but it's also that the culture exchange going outside the United States is, I mean, and that's in your family, like is to relativize and not swim in the water and see it a little bit with perspective is so it's good sides, it's bad sides, and everything in between is a great experience.
Yeah. And we know from psychological research that if you're going to encourage perspective taking or empathy or decrease intergroup conflict, which I would say right now in the United States, we're at very strong feelings of intergroup conflict, where it's kind of this us them mentality. That the contact hypothesis has, some of the stronger evidence in terms of how do we erode those boundaries. Is part of that is actually being exposed to people who are different from you, and not in a, you're seeing someone on TV and it's a stereotype, but actually having to live in someone else's world and walk in their shoes. And my former colleague, Adam Belinsky, who's now at Columbia, has a study of people who've worked abroad or lived abroad or studied abroad. And he finds that individuals who have done that actually have greater lifelong creativity, but also adaptability, because the act of having to really interrogate your own position, but also see how things can be different, just does something to us that makes us more open in the long term. And I do think that getting out of our comfort zone, seeing places that are very different from where we live, whether that's within the United States or outside of it, is for everybody, is important in terms of fostering that openness to others and reducing intergroup conflict.
So what do we do about this? Right. You said
I don't have to solve anything, but I just write about it. But
well, but I mean, it's interesting, so interlocking systems,
yeah.
which mutually beneficial systems that are working together, right? Higher ed and these elite firms and these, and so that says to me that they're incentivized not to get out of this. And so then I start to think, you start thinking like, okay, well, what's going to challenge? You get a little activist and you start saying like, what exactly is going to be a pressure point to change that system if the education and and employers are synchronized together? How does one challenge or this, alter this? When, yeah, I mean, yes, we could have more objective hiring procedures, and you document some of these things in the book and expanding and everything else, but it seems like their incentives are not set up to change. So is that right? And what would you do to start shifting that system?
You have to change the incentive systems, right? And that can be done in a number of ways. That can be done on the client side, right? So in large law firms with gender diversity, for example, there have been movements not to hire firms that don't have certain percentage of gender representation in their firms, and that information is publicly available for large law firms through now. That has been influential. There's some academic work to show that when clients start demanding things, there can be change. So that's one type of incentive. Another can be, social movements, boycotts, things like that. That can be another incentive for change, right? Again, in the legal world, and again, given that we have this now database that provides transparency on the basis of gender, race, and to some extent sexual orientation in terms of who's openly out in their firms. Students at Stanford started to boycott firms that weren't sufficiently diverse, and so it ramped up people's attention to what was going wrong in the process. So I think that, whether it's clients, whether it's social movements on behalf of students or candidates, whether it's social policy, the incentive system has to change, right? There also can be sources of change within a firm, right? Goldman Sachs stopped doing on-campus recruiting first round, in theory, or they say they did, Ivy League colleges, and that was partially driven by a senior level executive saying, I didn't go to an Ivy League school and I'm smart. Let's crunch the data internally to see if people from Ivy League schools are doing better, and they weren't. So why are we spending all this money doing this? They replaced it with something that may be perhaps more biased than what they were doing, but it's an example of change, right? Someone gotta care enough to try to make the change, and then there has to be some incentive, whether that is in terms of talent, in terms of legal, in terms of economic, in terms of power that has to take place. So right now, I don't foresee change happening, but it could.
Well, it's interesting. So I'm a part of there's a cohort are you familiar with Heterodox Academy?
I've heard
Jonathan
of it.
Haidt?
Yeah.
Yeah. So we're one of the founding. There's like 25 cohorts of this. There was I don't know if there was one at Northwestern. The one, all the no Ivy League. I guess no Ivy League, but Berkeley, North Carolina, Chapel Hill, some of the large publics, and bring and civil disagreement, open inquiry, viewpoint diversity, and I feel like almost that if there's something to I think that heterodoxy mix is some way going to become sexy again, where people don't actually want to be in a world that's in a bubble. They want to be exposed to people who are actually different than them, and that's I don't know, cool and interesting. Like you said, it's actually like it's exciting, and it creates a I don't know, maybe a different kind of way of thinking about how to bring unique people together to have real diversity, and have it be something that's attractive at a university level. And so, parents say to themselves, like, yeah, I don't know if I want to send my son or daughter, something way to the right or way to the left, or I'm not comfortable with a religious place. And there's a new kind of university that starts that has a little bit more of these disparate elements. It's probably going to come from a school like Western Michigan University that is not tied to the status, the game, and can we play the game differently, be a disruptor on the outside. I don't know if that means like champions that, because there's pressure on faculty, right? If I can say to everybody, yeah, they're getting these elite jobs and everything else like that, your incentives are to send them to where they're going to get a great starting salary. So I just wonder if that is that mashup in university is going to become something that changes this thing. Or maybe I don't want to send my kids to an Ivy League school. I mean, we deal with a lot of businesses here in West Michigan. West Michigan is a little more conservative. I mean, it is like anti Ivy League. And so I don't know if that's going to be a new way where we solve this as a society, but it it sounds daunting. And also I'm reminded of Ray Dalio and the kind of inequality is one of these key measures of the change of empires and in world orders. And your research, I think, just puts a glaring spotlight on that, what's currently happening. And there's no sign that it's going to get reduced, it seems. Is that true?
I'm going to phrase this in the best way I can. In order to curb inequality and create opportunity for people across the income spectrums and throughout society as a whole, it's going to require intervention. And right now, I think that there is a barrier on every political side to intervening, right? So I'm not sure how change can occur, right? That's what I'll say.
I mean, it's really interesting conversation. And the fact that you feel like intervention needs to happen, but you don't see it coming from either side, at some point, I just hope, I mean, that's why I'm part of this heterodox thing is I hope that you could have, like, I don't know, MAGA and Black Lives Matter in the room, and we just talk to each other and get to learn about these like different ways of viewing the world, and it actually happens, because otherwise it's just depressing.
I am doubtful that could happen in a really productive way when people are older. I think you'd have to get when people are younger, because what we see is that a lot of my colleagues at Kellogg study dehumanization. And when we get to the point, which I think we have in the US, in a lot of spaces where we stop seeing people who are different from us, whether it's politically, whether it's racially, whether it's through other types of demarcations, as fully human, we're in big trouble. And it is hard to overcome that, right? And I do also think that our social policies contribute to a situation where people are really looking out for themselves, right? And out for people who are like them, because there's a lack of social support and social safety net to care for all, right? And I just think those two dynamics together make it really hard for people to come together when beliefs are already entrenched and create meaningful change, right? In other aspects where people see the other party as human and worthy, you might see different effects. But I do think that in certain areas, we've tended towards dehumanization, and that is a recipe for all sorts of outcomes we don't want to see.
Is that I mean, is that social media again?
In terms of causing it, I mean, it doesn't, but I mean, again, I'm not the expert on it. A lot of my colleagues like Noor Katili and Adam Waits, they have examined dehumanization in an empirical way, and they'd be better people to speak about the source of it. Some would argue it could be human, but it can be exacerbated by cultural commentary, by social policy, and so forth.
Well, it was great. It was great to actually sit down and talk to you. I mean, I was a fan of I remember reading your nightclub paper, and I was at Boston College getting my Ph.D. in qualitative central there in Boston, and saw that. I'm pretty sure it was Candy Jones who's like, because I was talking about Michelle Lamont, and because we did this paper on firefighters, and it got published, and it was all about how do you develop trust in the absence of experience, because firefighters never fight fires. And so these leaps of faith that they make in the system that does that. And it was all these small cues. And that was the kind of connection when we were workshopping that to Michelle Lamont, then to Candy Jones, and to you, and then the monitor connection. So it was great to talk to you.
No, my pleasure. And thank you so much for sitting down. I really appreciate it.